worry. Good place to be.
Started on January 20th.
I think we're going to go on in very few minutes. What's the countdown? Josh, you? 1 minute. 1 minute. Good evening, and thanks very much for being with us tonight. And I want to thank everybody who's here in the audience here in the nation's capital, because they are very brave souls. They are here despite a rainstorm. Winds, we think, are going to be about 75 miles an hour, and there's also talk of tornado. Other than that, it's a beautiful evening here in the nation's capital, so we thank you. And I want to thank all of the folks who are with us tonight on live stream, and our media partners at The Guardian, at Young Turks, at The Intercept, The Nation, Credo, Move On, Now This, Act TV, and others who are streaming the event. So we thank them all very much. This is the third town meeting that we have done. And the reason we do these town meetings is we think the American people are a little bit smarter than the corporate media thinks they are. And we think the American people want to hear serious discussion about serious issues. Our first town meeting was on why the United States is the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right, and why we need Medicare for all. Our second town meeting dealt with the massive levels of income and wealth inequality that exist in this country today and what that means. And tonight, we're dealing again with an issue I think we are, as a nation, do not discuss to anywhere near the degree that we should, and that is foreign policy in general, perhaps from a different perspective than you will see often on cable TV. And obviously, what motivated this meeting tonight was President Trump's withdrawal of the United States from the Iran nuclear deal. And also, we are more than mindful of the tragedy that now takes place in Gaza, and we'll be discussing that as well. I think that in American politics, there is not the full degree of understanding in terms of what the implications of foreign policy are about. People are worried about health care, and they're worried about education and climate change, etc., but foreign policy often seems a little bit distant. So let me just say that if you are concerned about education and infrastructure and health care, you know what? You should be concerned about foreign policy, because foreign policy has a lot to do with military policy, and military policy has a lot to do with the expenditure of $700 billion a year. We are now spending as a nation more on our Department of Defense than I believe the next 10 nations combined. At a time when our infrastructure is collapsing, public schools are in desperate shape, 30 million people have no health insurance, Congress voted to increase military spending by $165 billion over a 2-year period. So that brings the issue of foreign policy kind of back home in terms of our national priorities. And the second issue in terms of foreign policy is that, tragically, sometimes it results in the loss of life for our brothers and our sisters and our neighbors. In my opinion, the war in Iraq was the worst foreign policy blunder in the modern history of this country. And it cost us over 4,400 American lives, 31,000 men and women who were wounded, came back without limbs or with PTSD. It cost the people in Iraq some 500,000 lives, displacement of some 3 million people, a cost of $2 trillion. That is foreign policy. So in terms of foreign policy, it's important that we get it right. It's important that we don't have that we understand the unintended consequences of war. Sometimes we think it's going to turn out a certain way, and it often turns out a very, very different way. So, with that, let me begin the discussion tonight and introduce to you our panelists. And we have a really distinguished panel with us. Joe, this is hard. I'm going to get it. Cirincione. How's that, Joe?
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Joe Cirincione is the president of the Plowshares Fund, an organization that works to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. On my immediate right is Suzanne DiMaggio, who is a senior fellow at New America, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and Asia. You have been to Iran a number of times, as well as North Korea, actually. Yes? Okay. Then we have with us Rob Malley. And Rob is president and CEO of International Crisis Group, which does research on conflict areas around the world. He was also a member of President Obama's National Security Council and was the director of their Middle East division. Is that correct? And finally, we have Lara Friedman, who is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, which promotes a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Joe, let me begin with you with a kind of a question I think is on many people's minds. And why is Trump's decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal with Iran such a problem, and what are the likely repercussions of that decision?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for holding this and spending time on this critical national security issue. President Trump's decision to violate the agreement was by far the most destructive act of his presidency. He broke faith with our allies. He dealt a crippling blow to the anti-nuclear efforts around the world. He severely damaged American credibility. But most seriously, I think he's put us on a path towards war in the Middle East. You may remember back in 2010, the talk in this town was when Israel was going to bomb Iran, not if. Front page, the cover of the Atlantic magazine, Jeffrey Goldberg's article. And that was the view. Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to bomb Iran. He went to his security cabinet twice trying to get agreement to do that. That's what motivated this diplomacy. Many of us in the NGO world were working with people in the administration and trying to encourage them to start the diplomacy, to find a diplomatic solution to this crisis. We found it. This was by far the strongest anti-nuclear agreement in decades, the crowning achievement of European diplomacy. And President Trump has just trashed it without a plan B, without any idea of what to do next, some rhetoric, some vows that we're going to go get a better deal, but no better deal is in sight. And without a diplomatic agreement, without the unity of the international community that was helped convince Iran to come to the negotiating table, the fear is whether Trump intends to or not, he's going to get drawn into the already hot conflicts in the Middle East that Israel and Saudi Arabia are deeply involved in, and they are trying to pull him in. And since he violated the deal, these conflicts have intensified. The violence in the Middle East has gotten worse, not better.
Suzanne, your take on the implications of Trump's withdrawal from the agreement?
I think this is probably one of the most catastrophic decisions we'll see coming out of the Trump administration, and I think that's saying a lot. I just came from a meeting in Europe where I had a discussion with a very well-placed Iranian, and he likened this move to the 1953 coup of the democratically elected prime minister of Iran, Mossadegh. That's when the U.S. and Britain overthrew this democratically elected government.
Let me interrupt you, Suzanne. And do you think many people in America know that in 1953, the United States and Great Britain overthrew the democratically elected government?
I don't think it's common knowledge, Senator, but I think it's important to look at the U.S.-Iran relationship in its full history. And as you'll find, there are a long list of grievances on both sides, this one I just mentioned. And for him to compare it to that, I think it really does demonstrate how much this has impacted the psychology of the Iranian people. With this Iran deal, don't forget, they saw hope as a way to improve their economy, join the global economy, become more engaged with the West. And I think the people of Iran really look to this deal in a very positive way. And with this careless, reckless move, Trump has just wiped that out. When you travel to the Middle East, I'm always struck when I travel to Iran. The people of Iran actually look very kindly on Americans. They don't like our policy, but they sure like us as people. And I'm afraid what Trump has done is one step towards losing the hearts and minds of the Iranian people and how they think of Americans.
Let me ask, thank you, Susan. Let me ask Rob a question. Our major allies remain in the agreement. What impact does Trump's decision have on U.S. relationships around the globe and with our major allies?
Not a good one. But let me start by thanking you, Senator, for organizing this. I think it really is important on a decision like this, on an issue like this, to involve the American people, to involve their representatives, because this is going to have very widespread repercussions. And as you said, foreign policy is domestic policy. But just let's put this in context. Again, I think Joe made this point. What the Trump administration, what President Trump has done is walk away from an agreement that everyone knows was working. That's not in doubt. Nobody is claiming that Iran was cheating. Nobody is claiming that Iran was moving towards a nuclear weapon. Everyone from, obviously I'm biased, I helped negotiate the deal, but forget me. The IEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, says Iran was respecting the deal. Every country that signed this agreement said that Iran was respecting the deal, even those that are harder line on Iran, like France. Our White House, our State Department, our intelligence community, our Pentagon, everyone was saying that this deal was being respected. So the only reason that President Trump decided to walk away is because it was a legacy of his predecessor, and he wants to undo that legacy, because it was a promise, even though it was an ill-founded and unsound promise he made to his electorate, and because he's surrounded by some people who believe that we should be in the business of changing the regime of Iran, or at least pressuring them to the point where they might break. So what does that mean to our relationship with other countries? It means that they can't trust us anymore, and it means that we're now no longer on the same page. And if the idea is to have a policy towards Iran that's going to work, there's no way the United States could do that on its own. The only way that we reached the Iran deal was because we had the Europeans with us. We had the Russians with us. We had the Chinese with us. Right now, we're alone. Maybe we have Israel. We have a few Arab countries, and we can come back to that later. But the rest of the world is united, and so we have this situation today, which is quite embarrassing, of most of the world and Iran against the United States.
Thank you very much, Rob. Lara, you know a little bit about Israel and Mr. Netanyahu. What is Israel's role in the ending of this agreement and in their views about the future of Iran?
Thank you, Senator. I'd be very careful to say what Israel's role is. I'm not inside the head of Bibi Netanyahu, and I'm not inside the decision-making. What I can evaluate are the facts as they are, as we see them. I think it's worth recalling that the path to the JCPOA, for those of us in the room who are old enough to remember that far back, you can remember Bibi Netanyahu at the UN with his poster of Iran with its cartoon bomb. Joe alluded to the article in The Atlantic, which was incredibly, far-reaching, comprehensive, and well-sourced, making the case that pretty much everybody was ready to bomb Iran. The Obama administration went into the negotiations that led to the JCPOA because the other path was a pretty direct path to war. The drums of war were beating both here and in Israel. They are clearly beating both here and in Israel again. Someone said it's a catastrophic decision. I think one man's catastrophe is another man's miracle. There are people who welcome a breakdown of this agreement and welcome the possibility about getting back to the possibility of regime change. And it's very clear. And there is a strong constituency for this in Israel, and their fellow travelers here are very much in the ascendancy. That is the direction this goes right now, based on where we are at this moment.
What interests me, although nothing about the president surprises me, but he did campaign as somebody kind of as an isolationist, somebody who does not want to continue regime change, save money and close down bases and so forth, and so on. In the midst of all that, he has hired as his Security Council chief John Bolton, who was, as I recall, one of the architects for the war in Iraq, lied about weapons of mass destruction, and so forth. What does that tell us? Thoughts?
I think that's a very interesting point. I always think of President Trump as having two voices in his head, two voices whispering, at least two. One of them is the one you refer to, which is during the campaign, he actually argued against entanglements. He's always mentioned the $7 trillion we wasted in the Middle East. He was against, he says, maybe belatedly, but still against the war in Iraq. He said he was against intervention in Syria, against intervention in Libya. That's one voice. The other voice is a voice that says, I have to do everything Obama didn't do. I have to undo his legacy. And the voice that says, I got to be tough. I got to show that I'm prepared to fight back, that I'm the macho. And, as you say, who surrounds himself with people who today are giving much more voice to that second voice, who are amplifying it. It's John Bolton. It's even Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Both of them are on record as saying that the best way to deal with Iran's nuclear program is to change the regime. They've said, by the way, the same about North Korea. So I think there's a struggle for President Trump's soul, if I could put it that way. But right now, that latter voice, the one that is dangerous, the one that is putting us on a path to confrontation. Because let's assume tomorrow that Iran decides to respond to what the U.S. did by resuming its nuclear program. Then we're back with what Lara said. We're back to 2010. And then the voices, the John Boltons and others, could tell the president, you got to hit. You got to show the world, you got to show Iran that the U.S. is back. We got our mojo back. And then we're on that very, very dangerous path against which President Trump himself warned us when he was a candidate.
You know, I'm not so sure. Well, first of all, I think with this move, President Trump has for sure put us on an escalatory path with Iran. But I'm not so sure he sees a path towards war with Iran. I do think that perhaps he sees a war outside Iran among its proxies and skirmishes happening. And maybe he's deluded enough to think that he can manage those crises and they not escalate into a full regional war. I think that's very dangerous. The other thing that I think he's done that's been so destabilizing is that he has thrown the U.S.'s full support behind Saudi Arabia. And he has stoked the fire within the Middle East rather than calm it. And it's strategically such a bad move because the U.S. traditionally has sought to play a role of a moderator or an honest broker. And by siding completely with the Saudis, we've relinquished that role. We've given up any leverage we have in actually playing a constructive role in trying to mediate that conflict. So I think that is a very short-sighted approach. And the Iranians have consistently said they're ready to come to the table in regional dialogue with the Saudis, and the Saudis are not. Well, why should they? Why should MBS come to the table? He feels emboldened. He has the full support of Trump. There's no reason for him to come and negotiate and compromise in any way. So I think that's another element of the Trump approach to the Middle East and this deal that is very dangerous.
Let me ask a kind of dumb bunny question, and maybe the answer is obvious, but I'm not sure everybody knows it. As Suzanne just mentioned, we are now, and I've been in kind of high-level classified meetings where people refer to Saudi Arabia as our forever ally, our kindred spirit. Meanwhile, correct me if I'm wrong, Saudi Arabia is a despotic autocracy. We can argue about how good or fair the Iranian elections are, but they do hold elections. I'm not quite sure that the Prince of Saudi Arabia was elected to anything. He has the distinction of having purchased the most expensive house in the world, a $500 million yacht, and I guess a Leonardo da Vinci painting for $400 $50 million, while bemoaning the suffering of the people in Gaza. Why has the policies of the United States been so steered toward Saudi Arabia and so anti-Iran, when in fact you have, as you mentioned, Suzanne, among the younger people of Iran, what most of the country is under 30 now. They're very pro-Western. They feel a lot better about the United States than the young people in Saudi Arabia. Joe, how did that happen?
I think the simple answer is money. Before the Iranian Revolution, 1979, our main client in the Middle East was Iran, was the Shah of Iran. They bought most of our weapons. They were the linchpin of our security. But since the revolution, America hasn't done much business. In fact, we're sanctioned. American companies are sanctioned from doing business with Iran. And the money has all gone to more the Arab states. So Saudi Arabia is a main purchaser of U.S. military equipment. You saw the meeting in the Oval Office where Donald Trump could not help himself. He was talking about the enormous check that Saudi Arabia is about to write us for about $100 billion worth of military equipment. Of course, there's the oil deals and those arrangements, and that is true of all the Arab Gulf states. And then Saudi Arabia and the Arab states used some of those oil riches to buy influence here in the United States. It is very difficult to go to an American university and not see some Sunni Arab endowed center, or to go to a think tank in Washington and not see major contributions or halls named after some of the Saudi princes. So they buy a lot of influence in this town. They buy a lot of business in this town. But if it was simply that, it wouldn't be so bad. What's happened now is that Saudi Arabia is in a struggle for regional dominance with Iran, and they want to draw us in on their side. They want us to be actively involved militarily in pushing back the Persian Shia state, and Israel has decided to block with Saudi Arabia, and so you're setting up this major regional conflict that, as Suzanne has said, if we had just played our normal historic moderating role, we might be tamping down instead of pouring gasoline on the fires. But Rob and Laura, this is really your area, Laura.
There is a history of mutual anger, recrimination, and between Iran and the United States since the revolution. I mean, what U.S. administrations, and not just this one, but going back to the Carter administration, would say is, Iran. There was a hostage crisis, support for organizations, and direct acts of terrorism against the United States, support for organizations that are also hostile to Israel. On the other side of the ledger, Iran would say support for the Shah, the shooting down of an Iran civilian aircraft that killed 200, or I forget how many Iranians. Civilians, support for Saddam Hussein and his use of chemical weapons against Iran during the very long Iran-Iraq war, etc.
Remind me if I'm wrong, but American outrage about the use of chemical weapons was not so loud.
It was pretty muted, I think is a fair word.
We blocked the UN Security Council resolution that was going to condemn Iraq for using chemical weapons.
So there's a history there, but the way to resolve that history is through diplomacy. You could put pressure, but it's through diplomacy. The only way in which the United States and others have managed since the Iranian Revolution to change one aspect of Iranian behavior was through the nuclear deal that President Trump just shredded. That was a successful way to engage with Iran, to get them to change their behavior. We should, instead of ripping up the deal, we should be building on it, talking to Iran about parts of their policy that we resent, and they're going to put a lot on the table that they resent: our primary embargo, our support for Saudi Arabia, our arms sales to Saudi Arabia, our policy toward the Middle East in general. But what we're doing now is simply, as Joe and others have said, we're simply fueling the flames of a conflict because we are not talking to Iran. There's no diplomacy with Iran right now, and we're in the midst of an escalatory dynamic.
I think, Senator, it's important to remember the other thing, that by withdrawing from this deal, the one official channel we had with the Iranians is now gone. And that was the channel called the Joint Commission, where we met with the Iranians and our other partners to discuss this deal. Well, now that we're not a party to it anymore, we don't get a seat at the table. And when you think about it, we're now back to prior to the deal, when we didn't have official channel with Iran. That's very dangerous, because that channel has served to help, I think, stave off conflict that could have gotten out of hand. For example, when those Iranian sailors strayed into, U.S. sailors strayed into Iranian waters, it was because of the channel between the U.S. and Iran over the nuclear deal that helped to diminish that from escalating into a big deal. That's gone now, and that's very dangerous.
Okay. Review for us, a little bit about what's going on internally in Iran right now. We were talking earlier, Suzanne and others have suggested that if you are a hardliner in Iran, you are really delighted and happy with what Trump has done. On the other hand, if you are a moderator, if you're a young person, want to reach out to the world, if you want better Iran being part of the global community in a way it isn't right now, you're not very happy. So this decision has benefited the hardliners in Iran. Is that correct?
Well, ironically, it was the hardliners that began the negotiations with the U.S. During the Ahmadinejad period, but then with the advent of Rouhani and his election, that's when things really started to crystallize. So I think the group of negotiators in Iran that brought this deal to the fore, they took a major personal risk in doing this, advocating for engagement with the United States, the great Satan. So now, here they are. They were the people that put their necks on the line to become part of this deal. And, of course, the hardliners are taking great advantage of it by calling attention to the fact that they were treasonous, that they put Iran's interests in jeopardy. It's important to remember that the Iranian political system is as complex as ours. Even a bit more cutthroat, if you want to think about it. It's not, they're competing power centers, and it's a very dynamic political system. So now what I'm afraid we may see is a rise in power of the more conservative, hardline voices because this deal has not worked out for the moderates.
They are saying, we told you so. You can't trust
Absolutely.
the United States.
Even the leader himself, Khamenei, has essentially said, look, I told you that we cannot trust the United States, and what happened just now proves that.
I just say, I mean, just to build on what Suzanne said, during the negotiations, who in Iran was talking against it? Who was arguing against it? It's the hardliners in Iran, at the same time as the Trump administration says that this deal was benefiting the hardliners and benefiting the Revolutionary Guard. They were arguing against it. They didn't want to see it come to pass. So I think we could trust their judgment, that they thought this deal was not good for the hardline Iranians. It was better for the more pragmatic forces, which this decision by President Trump has just undermined.
You know, go ahead, Laura.
I would just add, we were talking beforehand, and we've all had these conversations in the past week about what the unintended consequences of this decision by the Trump administration might be. And the question of whether one unintended consequence is strengthening the hardliners, weakening the moderates. And I really do believe that that is a feature, not a bug, of this policy. It is much easier if you are someone who believes that this deal could not be fixed, it had to be nixed, and actually believes that the Iranian regime cannot be fixed, it must be nixed. It's much better to be dealing with an absolutely irredeemable hardline interlocutor, we should say. You're not actually talking to them. And you can say that's the real face. That's our real enemy, the implacable enemy that we have to defeat utterly.
So both Trump here and the hardliners there got their wish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They did. And there is this myth in town that the Iranian regime might be on its last legs. You know, let's not kid ourselves. There are major structural problems inside Iran. They're suffering from years of drought. There's major unrest, especially in the rural areas. This is a very unpopular regime. None of us would like to live in Iran. None of us would choose to live under this kind of autocratic regime. But it is also very resilient. It is also a stable government structure at the moment compared to everything else that's going on in the Middle East. And you hear, all you do is read the Iranian press or English translations of it, and you see Iranians protesting against their government, but they don't want to go so far as to destabilize the government. They don't want to overthrow the government because they don't want the chaos that they see going on in Syria. So there's this myth in this town that if we just knock hard enough, that somehow the Iranian regime's gonna crumble. And what I fear is exactly this, that the hardliners will come to power. You don't like the Iranian regime now, this could get a whole lot worse.
I think it's important at this stage to say, I mean, maybe it goes without saying, but I think it's important that there are activities the Iranians are undertaking in the region that undercut U.S. interests. There's no question there that that's happening. And, but the point is, how do you go about changing that? How do you go about addressing it? I think your op-ed today in The Guardian makes the case through dialogue. And with this deal, I mean, think about it. When I brought up the case of Mossadegh's overthrow, the democratically elected prime minister, when we overthrow him, that was 65 years ago. And there have been a lot of grievances in this relationship. And yet, 3 years ago, we reached this deal with the Iranians. It was a triumph of diplomacy. And yes, the relationship isn't perfect. It's far from it. But we should have used it as a, I think the Iranian foreign minister called it, we should use it not as the floor, but not as the ceiling, but as the floor. And we're doing the exact opposite. I think for the Trump administration, the idea of doing the work, the hard work of diplomacy, is so foreign to them that maybe it was too much to think about. But yet it's an opportunity. Here we are again, an enormous opportunity we've squandered to build on that deal and to make it something more lasting, to change the essence of the relationship in a meaningful way. And it was just discarded without a plan B, without any alternative. And I think that the administration has not offered anything in terms of where we go from here. And our European allies certainly are grappling with this now. They're faced with a region where they're adjacent to this region. They have the influx of refugees from all the conflicts. So this was not only, this was an attack on our European allies' sovereignty, on their economic relationship with Iran, but also on their national security.
Yeah. American policy in the Middle East is in free fall. We have no clear plan. We're losing friends, losing influence, losing allies. This could get very dangerous.
I just want to add, I'm not sure. I've heard people say there's no plan B, and I think from any sort of objective analytical standpoint, that seems correct.
Constructive plan
It's
B.
the constructive, because I do think there are plan Bs, and we've already heard them. We've heard them in the media. Suddenly we're back to the narrative of, well, if we push a little harder, the Iranian people will overthrow their government. They just need our help and support, which is a movie that we've seen before, not just on Iran. Let's take Gaza, for example. We've seen that exact movie before. History would argue that the U.S. has never had success at turning other people into tools of our foreign policy by making them so miserable. They say, let me take up the flag of your foreign policy.
We are consistent. We keep making the mistake over and over again, right?
Well, you know, again, I don't want to pretend I'm in the heads of the people I disagree with. I think a lot of people believe this should be true.
Yes.
And if it turns out not to be true, at least we should have tried. And if it turns out not to be true and we're forced to go to war for the sake of humanity, we are. But that is sort of the plan B here. We will help and try to have them overthrow themselves, and if forced, because don't forget, if Iran does go back to centrifuges spinning, we are back to the discussion of it being an existential threat. That was Bibi Netanyahu with that bomb. And when it's an existential threat to Israel, how many days is it till they go nuclear? Is it 10 days? Is it 100 days? It's constantly changing target. At that point, we have no choice but to act because it's an existential threat.
I want to get back to Saudi Arabia. NBS did a multi-million-dollar tour of the United States. He was in a lot of media, met with a lot of influential people. What is Saudi Arabia really, and what are its goals?
Well, I think, you know, the Saudis are in the midst of a leadership transition. I think that, when you look at what President Obama tried to do to rebalance the U.S. in the Middle East by having a relationship with both the Iranians and the Saudis, maybe to some extent underestimated the insecurities of the Saudis during this pivotal period and underestimated how threatening they would see the fact that the U.S. is beginning a relationship with Iran. That's something we can debate. But when we think about the Saudis, they have this humanitarian disaster that they've created in Yemen, a war, by the way, that the United States has not spoken out against too harshly. And
I would say that's an understatement. Yes.
I'm putting it diplomatically. Then you have, if you look at every major crisis point in the Middle East, the solution to it somehow runs through Riyadh and Tehran. And if you also look at this undertaking that MBS, the Saudi prince, is trying to take for a major reform effort by the year 2030 in Saudi Arabia, it's very forward-looking if he can pull it off. It really makes you wonder, what are their priorities, and why aren't we encouraging that reform effort, telling them, find a solution in Yemen, stop that catastrophic war, get to the table with the Iranians, work that out, find a political settlement in Syria, strengthen this new government that's going to happen in Iraq. I mean, there are some serious issues that we should be encouraging the Saudis and Iranians now to come to the table and resolve, and we're doing the exact opposite.
Rob?
Yeah, so I'd say, and I've had an opportunity to discuss this with Mohammed bin Salman several times. I think from his perspective, to try to put myself in his shoes, he believes Saudi Arabia for too long has been a punching bag that Iran has been hitting, and that he believes Saudi Arabia is stronger militarily, diplomatically, has stronger allies. Why shouldn't Saudi Arabia fight back? Now, the problem with the fighting back is that everything that people say today is an indication of Iran expanding its reach in the region has been the result of people going to war in the region. The Iraq War, obviously, number one. If it hadn't been for the Iraq War, Iran would not have the influence it has today in Iraq. The war in Lebanon, talk back in the 1980s. The war in Lebanon, Israel's invasion, that gave rise to Hezbollah, that gave Iran a hook in Lebanon. Yemen, we just heard about, a humanitarian disaster, the worst humanitarian disaster in the world today. Mm-hmm. What's increased Iran's influence? It's the coalition, Saudi-led coalition bombing of Yemen. The Houthis, the Shiite organization there, has become closer to Iran in reaction, and on and on and on. The same in Syria. War is what has expanded Iran's influence. And so, and I've said this to the Saudis, I've said, you may think that by pushing back Iran militarily, you're going to help yourself. You're simply going to empower Iran in a way that you're going to regret. So what I would criticize the Trump administration for, yes, they have much better relations with Saudi Arabia than we did under the Obama administration. Use that better relationship for sound policies, as Suzanne said. Put pressure on them to find a way out of Yemen. And by the way, I do want to thank you for your efforts on Yemen. I think we need more voices like yours to put the spotlight on that tragedy. Use it for that. Use it to push them to negotiate with Iran. Use it constructively. Use that better relationship you have with Saudi Arabia and with Israel, by the way, but to a purpose that serves U.S. interests, not enabling them to make the mistakes that they and we are going to pay for.
Lara, do you want to say a word about Israel and back it up a little bit? Israel today is not the political state that it was 20 years ago. It has undergone massive transformation. And, I asked Rob what the long-term goals of Saudi Arabia might be. What are the goals of the Netanyahu administration there? And what are the changes that have taken place in Israel over the last couple of decades?
So it's a timely question because it's something that I think we can understand and explain better in the United States now than we could have 2 years ago. In the sort of arc of illiberalism, Israel is significantly ahead of the United States, but it's on very much the same path. You have an Israeli government which is tending further and further right, not simply for cynical reasons of, politicking and appealing to certain voters. There are real ideological roots in this. And what we're seeing today is very much in power, a trend towards illiberalism, much like we're seeing here or in Eastern Europe or wherever else, which says we have ideals, we will implement them, might makes right, rule of the majority, not democracy. Little interest in the power of the civil society or even preserving civil society, things like human rights, a disdain for international law, international norms, to the extent that they in any way conflict with those goals. And what we're seeing today, and we had it on display in Jerusalem today. If anyone saw the visuals, the split screen of the celebrations in Jerusalem, the American officials, starting with Mr. Kushner and the president's daughter, celebrating, and a split screen showing tear gas and shooting on people inside Gaza. And I think it's important to emphasize, whether you want to argue that these are violent or non-violent, whatever, these are people who are inside Gaza. These are not people who've invaded Israel and are now threatening to take the town. This is shooting into Gaza. So you really have an alliance of illiberalism here. It isn't by mistake that Israeli policies are getting more and more energetic towards Iran, towards the Palestinians.
Aggressive might be another word.
Aggressive, yes. Or emboldened, let's say. This is an ideological strain. I think I think it's really important. When I said before, one man's catastrophe is another man's miracle, this is not happening, I think, by accident. And I think it's important to recognize the ideological roots of this if you're going to understand where it goes. These aren't just missteps all the way. These are deliberate steps. The Israeli government wants to keep the West Bank and Gaza forever. It wants every inch of Jerusalem. It's very clear about that. The American ambassador to Israel is absolutely in lockstep with that. And he's been on the record that way for years. Anyone who's surprised shouldn't be. And for folks who see the Trump administration as chaotic in their policymaking, I would encourage them to look at Israel-Palestine, and that reflects also on Iran, and note that the circle of people who have been the key advocates and the key advisors to the president on this issue are the same people who were his closest advisors before he became president. And they were the people who were his surrogates during the campaign. There's been remarkable coherence to their policy in the Middle East. And to the extent that we're talking about Saudi Arabia, I think it's a mistake to not focus on the Israel piece of that. Because the idea that MBS is going to deliver the Palestinians or going to give cover for Israel on Israel-Palestine is a potent piece of the puzzle here. It is a potent piece. It has enormous resonance here in the United States. It has enormous resonance in Israel, where right now Israelis see the alliance with Saudi Arabia as far more important than resolving the conflict that is on their border, where 50-some people were killed today. And even if you believe that Israel is 100% justified and it's an act of self-defense, Israel killed 54 people on it's not even a border, the Gaza fence. That's not a situation that's going to be resolved by making backroom deals with Saudi Arabia. But that's where we are today. And it really, the trajectory of this is not encouraging, not because of missteps, but because we're headed very deliberately in a direction that is not encouraging.
All right. Let's, while we're on Israel and Gaza, let's continue that discussion. I mean, it looks to me not only of the events of today, but just the actions of Israel over the last several years, plus the Trump administration repudiating the concept of a two-state solution, the growth of settlements, the kind of violence that we saw today. What is going to happen in the future when you have 2 million people in Gaza living in absolute desperation, 60% youth unemployment? What is going to be the future there? What do we see happening?
Let me start, but I have to admit my bias here, because I'm very pro-Israel. I have family in Israel. I have family in Jerusalem. I have a niece and a nephew who served in the IDF. I have a goddaughter who very recently was a sniper on the Gaza border. So I'm very concerned about their security, and I would never advocate a policy that would weaken the security of Israel. But what I fear is that the policies of this government in Israel are weakening the security of Israel, that Israel is becoming less and less secure by the Likud party's refusal to find a way to negotiate with the Palestinians, to end the occupation, to give some basic human rights to the people in that prison we call Gaza, that this is building up the frustration, the hopelessness to a point where it is going to explode. And today, I'm afraid, might have lit the fuse. This is the most Palestinians Israel has killed short of an outright war in a single day. This is more people than Palestinians that died during either one of the intifadas. This is an unprecedented situation, and in some ways, we're not paying enough attention to this because we're distracted by our own political circus at home. I mean, you know, if we didn't have this kind of internal division at home, I think this would be the top story everybody was discussing. We'd have American diplomats flying to the area to try to calm it down, to try to find some way to restart the peace talks. Instead, we have this show in Jerusalem that I just found out no Democrats were invited to this opening. This was a very selective audience here to celebrate this tragic turn in American policy. No American president, who are all strongly supportive of Israel, have ever thought we should move the embassy to Jerusalem, because it wasn't our place to decide that issue. The Palestinians and the Israelis had to decide what the borders were, and by doing this, we're intervening in that internal struggle, putting our thumb on the scale on one side, and all this just makes the situation worse. But every single other person on this panel is more expert. I'm just talking.
Let me just ask anyone to jump in. Talk a little bit about what is going on in Gaza right now. What's going on?
Sure, I'll try to take that one. I have not been in Gaza in a couple of years. What is going on in Gaza right now are a number of factors are coalescing. It come to a head. Part of it is Jerusalem. Jerusalem lit the fuse this time. The first fuse, Joe referred to a second fuse. Yeah. The announcement in December, which really, I mean, let's remember, Gazans can't get to Jerusalem. It's been years since Gazans have been able...
Explain that. Take it. You know this stuff upside, downside. Many people do not. What do you mean by they can't go?
So Palestinians who live in Gaza have restricted travel. To get from Gaza to Jerusalem, you have to cross through Israel. Israel does not let Gazans leave Gaza, except under very, very limited circumstances through a long permit process, which is arduous and generally, it's very, very difficult to travel. So most Gazans, if the average, I don't know what the percentage is, it's under 30, it's very high. A huge percentage of those people have never been to Jerusalem, have never been to the West Bank. They basically have only ever been to Gaza, or maybe they've gotten out through Egypt. It is a place that has been under blockade for a decade now. And this is one of the most densely populated places in the world. It is run by Hamas, which is a terrorist organization. It happens to have been democratically elected some years back. That was rejected by the world. Like Joe said, it's probably in the same sense as Iran. It's not probably a place you'd want to live. I would not want to live under a Hamas government. But living there is now for years, people in Gaza have had their lives subjected to all sorts of misery on the argument that this is the way to eject Hamas from Gaza. And it hasn't worked. What it means is today you have this densely populated place with a very, very high youth population, extraordinarily high unemployment, extraordinarily high poverty, dependent on outside aid, and you essentially, with the Jerusalem decision, said, by the way, there is zero political horizon for ending the conflict, and only an end to the conflict can actually resolve the situation you're in. Everything else is just giving you, bandages and some aspirin. That's what the Jerusalem decision was. But what we're seeing on the Gaza fence, and you can't call it a border because it's not a border, what you're seeing on the fence is all of the pressures that have built up over the years coming to a head with this decision. And then you've got Hamas trying to ride these pressures, and where they can direct them so that they can claim legitimacy. Because when the grassroots rises up and says we will not have it anymore, that's also a repudiation of the people in charge. And that's intolerable for Hamas, because Hamas needs to be in charge. So you have people fighting for who's controlling it, which gives Israel a sometimes legitimate, sometimes not legitimate excuse to say, this is all terrorism, this is an act of war, and under the laws of war, we have the right to use lethal force against unarmed people who are near the fence, which if they were to damage that fence and breach it, they could come into Israel and would be a threat to us. And I don't see, honestly, it dying. I suspect that we will see this period of intense demonstrations die down. A combination of fatigue, a combination of outside efforts to throw in more bandages and more aspirin, which I have to say it would be immoral at this moment to oppose food, bandages, aspirin, whatever it takes, because the humanitarian situation there is genuinely turning catastrophic. But we have to remember this is not an earthquake zone. This is an entirely man-made catastrophe. And the solution to it is not humanitarian aid. The solution to this is a political solution. And right now, going back to where we started, we are heading in the opposite direction from a political solution.
Rob, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I'd say, it's customary to say that the Arab world and the world is forgetting the Palestinians. I'll tell you some people who haven't forgotten the Palestinians, and that's the Palestinians. And they're the ones who are living in the situation that Lara described in Gaza, and also living in deplorable conditions in the West Bank where there is no political horizon. Now, the cost it's a human cost, no doubt about it, and it's a powder keg, and at some point it may explode. It may be today, it may be in a month, it may be in a year, but at some point, if people have no hope and they're living in these conditions, they have nothing to lose. But there's another cost to all this, which is really, and I was visiting the occupied territories a few months ago, and anyone who does, it's very hard to look at that and think that a two-state solution is still possible today, because of everything that's been happening in terms of the settlements and the roads and just the conditions on the ground. So then what? I mean, if you've killed the two-state solution, you've killed that paradigm, you've basically neutered all of the political leaders in Palestine among the Palestinians who were foot soldiers for that cause. What are you left with? Maybe a call for one-state solution, civil rights, equal rights for all. Are Israeli Jews going to accept that? So you may be setting up a perpetual conflict, which today we are enabling. Again, it goes back to the point we've all made. The U.S. can't solve this just because it wants to solve it, but to enable policies that are moving us away from a two-state settlement and that are moving us towards a potential conflict between a desperate population that has no hope and the Israeli government. That's diplomatic malpractice.
I would just add, going back again to this being a feature, not a bug, there have been Israeli people on the Israeli right and then people on the American side who support the Israeli right who have been arguing for years. There is no solution.
Right.
I mean, this is not the idea that no solution is a failure. There are many people who would argue there's never been a solution. The answer is for the U.S. to get behind Israel, let Israel do what it needs to do, let it define what it needs to do and what it wants to do. We get behind it and recognize the Palestinian that's just going to remain an unsolved issue.
Right.
That is actually a position that is advocated in our world.
So that's a group of 2 million people living in misery in Gaza with no political power in the indefinite future. Is that what you...
Well, it's more than that, because that includes the West Bank. The no solution refers to East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. So it's many more than that.
Yeah. Let me kind of end the discussion here. It's been a fairly pessimistic discussion, if I may say so.
Yes.
Because it's a pessimistic situation, and we're trying to look at it honestly. What would, well, I won't ask what the administration should do, because we know what they are doing, which is unprecedented. I mean, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think historically, administrations have always given at least lip service to trying to bring people together in the Mideast,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, whether they did it or not, at least they made the effort that we got to sit down and work it out, and peace is our goal. And in an unprecedented way, that is not really what Trump is saying. What should, one of the areas, and Rob mentioned this in terms of Yemen, where I think there is a growing understanding that in the Congress, the Constitution is very clear that it is the U.S. Congress and not the President who has war-making powers. And we all know that Congress has abdicated that on the Democratic and Republican leadership for a very long time. And some of us are trying to get it back and trying to get the Congress more involved on issues like the issues we have discussed here tonight. So I'm not going to ask you what the Trump administration should do, because we know what they are doing. What should those of us in Congress who believe that we should have an even-handed policy in the Middle East, in terms of Israel and Palestine as well, in terms of Saudi Arabia and Iran, what would make sense to you to see for those of us to be doing?
Well, in terms of Yemen, I think it's important to remember that the Iranians and the EU4, the French, UK, Germans, and Italians have now had, I think, 2 rounds of discussions on Yemen. And I suppose now that the United States this is through part of the JCPOA process, I don't know if the U.S. will even be part of this now. Let's face it, the Trump administration, with this move on the JCPOA, has abdicated U.S. leadership on a whole host of issues. It's not just the JCPOA. And I think we have to face reality. We can't really look to this administration for leadership on these crises, these issues of top national security importance to us. But what we can do now is, I just came from Europe last night, where I met with Europeans and Iranians. And what the Europeans are saying is they see this as a direct attack on their sovereignty. They're going to look for ways to continue to keep the deal alive, look for ways to maybe do blocking sanctions against the U.S., other ways of licenses so European businesses can continue to do business with Iran. And the Iranians, for their part, I think they're going to show a fair amount of restraint in the aftermath of this disastrous decision. I think they're going to continue to abide by the Iran deal. They're not going to restart the centrifuges. They're not going to kick out the inspectors. I think they're going to try to work with the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese to make this deal work, and work on the other issues you just mentioned. But again, the U.S. is absent. This is not America first. This is America alone. And I think the only way we're going to solve this problem is by electing a new president, a new Congress in November. I don't see any other solution, Senator.
Let me start. There's several things that the U.S. Congress can do now. And part of that builds off what Suzanne just said. We have to try to work with the Europeans to keep the deal alive. So if what we're worried about is the deal completely falling apart, remember, this is like the Paris Climate Accord. Just because the U.S. withdraws doesn't mean the accord is dead. No, the deal is still alive for now. And the Europeans and the Russians and Chinese are working, as Suzanne said, with the Iranians to try to keep them in. So what do they need? In order to do that, the Europeans need to be able to do business with Iran. But the administration's about to move to put sanctions on European companies. Remember, we don't do business with Iran. We don't sell, so you can't sanction our own companies. You got to sanction the other companies that are doing this. You got to start sanctioning the people who will buy or buying oil from Iran. Who's that? That's China, number 1, European Union, number 2, and Japan, number 3.
And India.
And India. So you got to start sanctioning those people. Well, that is idiotic. So we already have this rift developing between Europe and the United States. You know, we are weakening the Western alliance with this. Middle East, all those problems aside, we also have this other huge problem that this policy is creating. So I believe the Senate, the Congress has to step in and try to prevent the administration from imposing new sanctions on European companies. That's the number 1 thing I would do. The number 2 thing I would do is try to take another run on Yemen. You came real close. 44 senators voted for that resolution. If you could get a pause in the Yemen war, if you could stop the U.S. from aiding that slaughter, that would be a huge confidence build. That would be a huge humanitarian and peace building and stability building step in the Middle East. And you can do that without the administration.
I agree with you there. Let me deal with the secondary boycott issue. I mean, isn't this rather extraordinary that we are now putting sanctions on our major international allies? Is this of some unprecedented?
We've tried to do it before. It's not had much success. And I think, as Joe said, that's not a road we want to be on if we want to build a coalition to get anything done.
Yeah.
But, you said, and this is a pretty pessimistic panel. I want to apologize for people listening if it was, but I want to end on an optimistic note. I think the reason for optimism is the fact that you're holding a discussion like this, that people are listening, that many, many, many thousands are listening outside and following this. I think what can be done, and building on this, is having a more honest conversation with the American people, having a more honest conversation coming from members of Congress on issues like, what are we doing between Israelis and Palestinians? What are we doing with Iran? What are we doing with Saudi Arabia? What are we doing on the war in Yemen? What are we doing? Another issue that you've written about in the past or spoken about, what about a counterterrorism policy? Is it really the smart policy? We need to have a debate about that. We need to have a debate about war powers. And that's where hope comes from. It's from bringing Americans, engaging them, convincing them that this is not foreign. This is very much domestic. Because as you put it, this is where we put our resources. This is how we send our men and women to war. So foreign policy is domestic policy, is public policy.
Let me just conclude by saying that I think the overwhelming majority of the American people believe that the function of the United States in global politics is to do everything that we can to prevent war and the incredible, what really bothers me, and I speak as the former chair of the Veterans Committee, how easy it is for people to give these great speeches about war and bombing and all that stuff, and then you meet with the families and the young men and women who come home from these wars and the kind of terrible suffering we have seen in our own country as a result of Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention, the 500,000 dead in Iraq and the massive displacement of people, all of the suffering that exists. And I say, sometimes we don't see that. Sometimes we don't see that as a people. But I do believe that in our heart of hearts as a people, the American people do want to see their government play a constructive role around the world, understanding how difficult it is, but bring people together. Get them to sit down. Get them to put away the guns and the planes and the tanks. And it is a sad thing that at this moment we're doing the exact opposite. But I agree with you. I mean, this may have been pessimistic in the sense that we're talking about reality. But I don't think that is where the American people want us to be. And especially when we talk about a world, think about it, a world now. We got children all over the world living, dying unnecessarily because their parents don't have a few cents to buy a medicine to cure an easily treated disease. You got people living on $1 a day, $2 a day, and the world is spending, well over $1 trillion a year on weapons of destruction. Our role should be the role of bringing people together, striving for world peace, as hard as that may be. And I am not pessimistic that is where the American people are. So let me just conclude by thanking our panelists, thanking all of you for being here this evening, and thanking those who are watching us live stream. Thank you all very much.